All right, so teaching the Great Gatsby. The still here, as many of you may know, is from the 2013 production of The Great Gatsby with Leonardo DiCaprio. This image is mostly famous because it gets memed all the time. I'm just, as a personal opinion, I don't recommend either of the well-known movies of Gatsby. I think that the DiCaprio version and the Robert Redford version from 1974 are just not that great. So I wouldn't recommend taking time in your classroom to show them, but again, up to you. You may know better what works. Okay, let's go here. Okay, today's agenda. So free throw, sorry. Okay, so I have 3 icebreaker questions, and I would like you to put your responses in the chat. And what I'm going to do with these responses is we'll compile them, and then I'm going to use them in planning next week's session. But I do have 3 icebreaker questions, and if you could just take 30 seconds, a minute to answer them and just put that in the chat, I would really appreciate it. The first one is, what do you personally like best about The Great Gatsby? The second one, what do your students like best about the novel? And finally, what do you personally find most difficult, or for those of you who are teaching it for the first time, what concerns you most about teaching The Great Gatsby? So I'll give you a few seconds. I'll move on in a second, but I'll give you a few seconds. If you could just put your answers there in the chat, I would appreciate it. And then, as I said, we'll compile it, and I'll use it next time as I kind of craft what we're going to do for that. So just hold on for 1 second while you all put some stuff in there, and don't feel rushed. You can continue doing it while I talk. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about Fitzgerald's life. Like I said, Fitzgerald's life is important for several reasons. The first one is that he was a genuine world famous celebrity. He was one of the most famous people in America. And so his life was of interest during his life, and his life continues to be of interest. Another reason that we should understand this is that much of his fiction is very autobiographical. So Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, on one of the nicest streets in St. Paul. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been there. Summit Avenue, it's called. This is the house in which he was born, or where he was living, in which he was born. It was an upper middle class part of a working class town. And class is really important when thinking about Fitzgerald's work, not just Gatsby, but all of his work. He's extremely concerned with social class. And one of the reasons is that his class position was extremely precarious. His family were middle class, but barely hanging on. He was actually descended from Francis Scott Key, the composer of the Star Spangled Banner, and so on his mother's side. And so the family really saw themselves as having a kind of exalted and aristocratic background. Again, this is really important for his life and his fiction. In 1897, the family moved to Buffalo, New York for his father's job. His father was an alcoholic, and he was in Buffalo, and they were there for about 10 years. Because of his drinking, his father lost his job, and so they had to live on his mother's inheritance. Eventually, because they couldn't make a go of it in Buffalo, they moved back to St. Paul, and that's where Scott was enrolled in Catholic school. For what it's worth, St. Paul and Minnesota are the twin cities. St. Paul and Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is very Protestant, and St. Paul is traditionally the Catholic side of it. And so, as Scott later on in his life would try to insinuate himself into American aristocratic circles, his Catholicism would often get in the way. Now, I saw that someone raised your hand. Did someone have a question? Feel free to unmute yourself. Was there okay. All right. If not. So after he moved back to St. Paul and he was enrolled in this Catholic school, he started writing stories. So by the time he was 10 or 11, he was already writing stories and submitting them to the school literary magazine. So what we see in this very early part of his life is the influence of his Catholicism, his Middle Western heritage, and his precarious class position that was brought about largely by his father's alcoholism. In 1911, they sent him to boarding school in New Jersey. It was a boarding school, like most of them. It was not a Catholic boarding school. And so he was now jumping into this sort of aristocratic East Coast life that became what he wanted to be. And if you want to live that life, you want to go to Princeton. Princeton is the place to be. It is the most social, it is the most aristocratic, and it is the most kind of fun of all of the three big East Coast schools, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And especially at this time, Princeton was the place to be. It was very successful in sports. It got a lot of coverage in the Eastern magazines. You had a lot of fun, like hijinks. And this, when you think about sort of turn of the century college life among sort of carefree rich young men, that's Princeton, and that's Scott Fitzgerald. And you'll see on the right here, he wasn't a particularly good student, but he really wanted to write. And so he would write plays, he would write music. You'll see here, he wrote a show called Phi 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 that was put on by the Triangle Club. The fact that he was allowed into the Triangle Club was one of his best triumphs in college, in a college career that had very few successes. It's impossible to overstate how homogeneous Princeton was at the time, all white, all rich, all men. In addition, and some of you had said in the comments that when you were asking about what you wanted to see in this, some attention to race. Princeton, unlike Harvard and Yale, was officially segregated for its entire history. They never let African Americans in. Harvard and Yale occasionally would go back and forth. But no, Princeton always. And for that reason, Princeton attracted the most Southerners of all of these elite East Coast schools. So when you're thinking about this milieu in which he lives, it is entirely rich, entirely white, entirely male. But he desperately wanted to be part of that world, desperately. When he was in college, he pursued a beautiful Chicago socialite named Ginevra King, and she was only 17 at the time. And he was desperately in love with her. But her family rejected him, even though she also was in love with him, because he didn't have enough money. His family wasn't rich enough. His family wasn't of that class. And so broke his heart. And he pined over her for a long time. And obviously, we see that in the story of Gatsby and Daisy. It's impossible not to see that in that story. As I said, his only real success at Princeton was as a writer and as a writer of musicals. He was a terrible student. He barely got in. And eventually, he had to drop out after 3 years. When he dropped out, the war was on. We weren't in the war yet. The United States wasn't in the war yet. But when he dropped out, he joined the United States Army and was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama. So he was in the Army during the war, but he never saw combat action and he was never sent overseas. While in Montgomery, he fell in love with a 17-year-old debutante, the most eligible debutante in Montgomery, Alabama. Her name was Zelda Sayre. And this is a drawing that somebody made of Zelda when she was 19. After the war ended, Fitzgerald, who by now decided that he wanted to be a writer, and that he wanted to be a famous writer, and that he wanted to be a famous writer who was married to Zelda Sayre, went off to New York City to work in advertising to make money, but also to start his writing career. And Zelda stayed back in Montgomery. They were not married yet. He failed miserably at everything. He was bad at advertising. He was bad in college. He wasn't a good soldier. And his writing didn't go anywhere. And the worst part was while he was in New York City in 1919, Zelda broke off the engagement. And Scott very seriously contemplated suicide at that point. But in 1920, Fitzgerald published a novel called This Side of Paradise, and it was a smash hit. It was a story about wealthy, carefree young men and women in a place very much like Princeton, young men who are chasing after socialites. There's a lot of partying, there's a lot of drinking, there's a lot of driving around in cars, everything that the young people were doing It was in many ways simply the story of Scott and Zelda up to that point, but it hit a chord. It was one of these books that expressed a kind of new feeling that was going on in the country, especially among young people. And so he was an overnight sensation. It expressed the carefree spirit and the sexual freedom of the 1920s. And we'll talk about this later, but when we think about the 20s, one of the things we think about is loosening moral standards, loosening rules and strictures around sexuality. This book had a lot of that. It's certainly not racy by today's standards, but at the time it was extremely racy, and many in fact felt it was quite immoral. So he's a huge star when this comes out. It's just a massive star. So then for several years, he makes most of his money writing short stories for magazines. The primary outlet for short stories at the time, this was before the New Yorker magazine was founded, was a magazine called the Saturday Evening Post, which had an enormous circulation. It was the most popular magazine in the country. It got all over the place. I'm trying to think of something that would be comparable even from my youth, but it would be like a combination of Time magazine and Life magazine and TV Guide and the Reader's Digest. It was everywhere. Everybody had it. And so publishing in it signified that you were a big, big deal. And Fitzgerald was in it all the time. He published dozens and dozens of stories in it. And the stories, like his novel, This Side of Paradise, were about the hedonism of this time that was going on. And when we think about the 1920s, we often call it the Jazz Age. We call it the Jazz Age because of Fitzgerald. He is the one who popularized that term, and he wrote these stories about it. He became one of the highest paid writers in the United States. And famously, the Saturday Evening Post in 1924, I believe it was, paid him $5,000 for one 3-page story. Today, that would be about $60,000. I know people who sell stories to magazines. Nobody gets $60,000 today. So he was incredibly successful and famous. And he was a star. He was a celebrity. People would follow him and his wife in the new celebrity magazines, and he would make fun of his status. And in 1924, he wrote, and this is well worth hunting down, and I didn't post it in the web resources because I didn't find a text that was reliable, but he wrote an essay for the Saturday Evening Post called "How to Live on $36,000 a Year," which would be like writing an essay on how can you manage to live on $500,000 a year today. Because he's just joking about how much money he and his wife waste every single day just by doing stupid things. I was trying to think of who they would be like in these early years of the 20s, and it's nothing short of like Beyonce and Jay-Z. They were enormous. They were huge. Everybody followed them. Everybody wanted to be around them. They were at every important party. You wanted to have them at your parties. So that's the kind of people they were. And that may be something to draw your students in. Thinking about celebrity culture, thinking about the author and wife as celebrity. Your students are probably too young to know the sort of Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston thing, but link it to celebrities of the day. I don't know, Will Smith, Jada Pinkett Smith, maybe. So the novel that we know of best of his is obviously The Great Gatsby. It was his third novel. He published a novel in 1922 called, I have it here, it's called The Beautiful and Damned. It again is a novel basically about his life. It's fine, it's not great. Great Gatsby, though, came out in 1925. Critics really loved it. They thought it was brilliant. They thought that he'd finally hit his sweet spot. Unfortunately, nobody else liked it. It made very little money. Readers didn't get it. It wasn't fun enough. The stories were really fun, but nobody wants to live the life of the people in Gatsby. It was a downer. And so people didn't love it. People didn't buy it. It wasn't a hit. He was crushed by this failure because he really, not to use a cliche, but he really poured his soul into the novel and adored it. And so he was really disappointed by the failure of this novel. It was hard for him, because he spent so much time partying, to sit down and focus and write and put his full effort into anything. And when he did, on projects like The Great Gatsby, and they failed, it crushed him. So this was really difficult for him. So when you have a disappointing experience like that, what do? You get the hell out. So he and Zelda went to Paris, because where else would you want to go? We all know that what was going on in Paris at the time in the 20s was what we now call the lost generation. So in 1924, and this is actually before the book came out, but he was working on it. And 1924, they moved to France, but they weren't in Paris yet. They were mostly living down in the south of France, hanging out with rich people on the beach in Cannes and Antibes and places like that. He eventually finds his way, though, to Paris, and everybody is in Paris. And I think we all know about the romance of Paris in the 20s. We've all seen everything from the Woody Allen movie that came out a few years ago. We've seen the pictures of everybody at as you can see in this picture here, at the Closerie de Lila, hanging out in the cafes and all the parties and the art and the Josephine Baker and all of it. And so he was living that life. What you may want to emphasize in talking about this to your students, though, is that all the writers who were living there, who we now think of as famous, like Hemingway and Pound and Gertrude Stein and Robert McCallum and all the artists and the writer, and Picasso and Brancusi, and all these people who were there, they were bohemians. They didn't have any money. They weren't famous. They didn't have a penny to their names. They would spend all day hanging out in the cafes. And they were making art that nobody appreciated. So they saw themselves as a kind of artistic elite. They were cultured. They were the avant-garde. Fitzgerald shows up. He's not the avant-garde. He's not an unpopular, obscure writer. He's the most famous writer in America. So although Fitzgerald comes over and he's linked with the lost generation, and especially with his frenemy, Ernest Hemingway, we often link the two together, he really wasn't part of that crowd. He was hanging out with the wealthy. He was hanging out with high society in Paris. And because of that, he spent even more time partying and not writing. And another idea that you might incorporate into your teaching would be the Ernest Hemingway story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Now, have any of you heard of The Snows of Kilimanjaro? Have you read The Snows of Kilimanjaro? It's a wonderful story about a Hemingway. It's from later in Hemingway's career. It's about a Hemingway-esque writer, adventurer who's in an airplane crash and he's dying of gangrene. It's a depressing story. But in the story, he thinks about his friend who was a big partier writer in Paris and drank away his talent. And so it is Hemingway's very mean portrait of Fitzgerald as Hemingway is sort of thinking back on it. And Fitzgerald really resented it and really was hurt by that when that story came out, because this is later in Fitzgerald's life when he really was drinking his life away. So I would consider Hemingway and Fitzgerald to be frenemies, but they're very closely linked in the public mind. So the Fitzgeralds spend a lot of time in Paris. They're mostly drinking, they're mostly partying, they're mostly hanging out with wealthy people. They go down to the south of France and rent a big villa and do the same thing. They're not getting anywhere. They come back to the United States in 1926. He's broke. He didn't know how to save a dime. The minute a dollar would come in, going right out the other side. Fortunately, what we start having in the 20s is a film industry in Hollywood. The initial American film industry was based in New York City and Queens, but pretty soon they learned that you could film outside 12 months a year in Los Angeles, and there was a lot of land and it was really cheap. So the film industry, starting in the teens and by the 20s, has completely moved to Los Angeles. And a lot of writers start following it because there's a lot of money in it. So desperate for money, Fitzgerald goes to Hollywood. And Scott starts writing for the movies. This is something that your students might be interested in. A little bit about early Hollywood. Again, this was silent film time. And this was also, Fitzgerald never really got any credit. I mean, you can never like point to a movie and say like, oh, Fitzgerald wrote that, because he never got credit. He was mostly a script doctor. But so he does move out there in 1926. He writes for the movies. And again, the Fitzgeralds do what they do. They party, they hang out with movie stars, they drink, and they start fighting with each other. It doesn't work out. And Scott makes no progress on his own writing, and he's still in a funk because of The Great Gatsby. In addition to the fact that he's now developed full-blown alcoholism himself, like his father, he has terrible work habits. He can't get himself to sit down and work. It's one of the one of the points of contention, or one of the sort of like points of friction between him and Hemingway, was like, no matter how obnoxious Hemingway was, when he needed to work, he would work and he could focus and work. Fitzgerald was always distracted by something else. Zelda, by this time, has also started to develop what we would call probably bipolar disorder. It's not terrible yet, but she's sort of up and down and up and down. She wanted to be a writer, and she did write some stuff. She wanted to be a dancer, but she's now starting to show the signs of pretty serious bipolar disorder. So I do have a little interlude here. This is a novel. Let me back up for a second. Has anyone here, and I'm going to look at this gallery, has anyone here heard of the writer Anita Loos? Anita Loos. Has anyone ever heard of her? She's one of these fantastic but forgotten figures. And for those of you who have the time in your classes, I would recommend having your students read Anita Loos's 1925 novel, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I suspect many of you have heard that title because it became a very famous Marilyn Monroe movie. But Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was a novel that Anita Loos wrote, came out in 1925, and it's basically about two ditzy young women friends who are gold diggers and latch onto rich guys and work their way up. And it's a kind of, the main character is your classic, like, she seems ditzy, but she's actually really smart sort of character. Like This Side of Paradise, huge hit, just enormous hit immediately. And Anita Loos, absolutely smart woman. And so Anita Loos, her novel, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, I think pairs really nicely with Gatsby, because they both are about exactly the same time period. And especially when you think about the depiction of women in Gatsby and the depiction of women in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and how that reflects what's going on in the 20s, I would really recommend that for those of you who have the time in your classes to take about 2 weeks on that. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is a very short novel. It's like 120 pages. It's a really nice little pairing. So just as and this is not something you're going to want to talk about in your classes, but I find this to be a fun little side anecdote. So later on in the 30s, when Fitzgerald has to come back to Hollywood to make a little extra money, Anita Loos is there, and she's a high-profile screenwriter. So there's a big popular play on Broadway called The Women. It's by Claire Booth. It's a pretty popular playwright. And it's about a bunch of rich ladies who are going to Reno to wait out for their divorces becoming final. Well, they want to make it into a movie. It's a huge Broadway hit. Let's make it into a movie. So they assign it to Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald writes the screenplay. It's terrible. So Anita Loos walks in, rewrites the screenplay, gets the screenplay credit, and the movie becomes a big hit. And if you haven't seen this movie, The Women, starring Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, and Rosalind Russell, and directed by George Cukor, treat yourself to it. It is a fantastic movie, totally hilarious. And the fact that Scott Fitzgerald actually wrote the first screenplay of it makes it even more interesting. Okay, all right, back to sad things. So the 30s were not good. The 30s were not good for the Fitzgerald. Eventually, Zelda was institutionalized, and Scott usually tried to live near where she was being hospitalized, often in Maryland. Scott's alcoholism deepened. Again, he kept writing, he kept making a little bit of money, but he was having a hard time. And the Great Depression made his stories about rich people partying all the time seem really frivolous. It was one thing in the 20s when everybody was kind of having a good time, but the Great Depression, that's not where the public mood was. He did complete a novel in 1934 called Tender is the Night, which had some success. It's a story of a married couple who are having marital difficulties, like somebody we could mention. But if you're interested in this time period of his life, and if you want your students to maybe learn more about this declining time period of his life, he wrote a series of essays for Esquire magazine called The Crack Up. And I'd strongly recommend these essays. They were collected in a book called The Crack Up that's easily available. And Fitzgerald may not have been a very responsible person. Fitzgerald may not have been a very reliable person, but he was an honest person. And when he wrote about himself and his flaws, he was extremely honest. And so these essays about how did I end up where I am right now are brilliant and heartfelt. And it's also a portrait of what it was like to live through the Jazz Age, which he called the greatest, gaudiest spree in human history. He was the man who kind of invented the mythology of the Jazz Age. And in these novels, he talks about what it did to him. I mean, in these essays. In 1938, he returned to Hollywood for some more screenwriting. That was when he was writing The Women. He also he did some script polishing on Gone with the Wind, of all things, but we don't know exactly what he did. And in 1940, he died of complications from alcoholism at age 44. So if we're thinking about Fitzgerald's life in The Great Gatsby, here are the points that I would hit. Here are the points that I would call our students' attention to. Number one, it's a story of a poor boy from the Midwest who wants to remake himself and surround himself with rich and famous people. That's Jay Gatz, obviously, but that's also Fitzgerald himself. It's a story of someone who has been shamed because he's been rejected by a woman because he wasn't wealthy enough. And he feels compelled to show her and the members of her class how wrong they were and regain her. And yes, these are stories of women as mediums of exchange. Women are the objects on which men show their social worth. And I think Fitzgerald always had a problem getting past that. It's also a novel about the conflict between just having a good time and not wasting your talent. It's a novel about the decadence of wealthy East Coast aristocrats such as Daisy and Tom and Jordan. It's a novel about the allure of being around rich people, how fun it is to be around rich people, and the way that rich people surround themselves with parasites, and how when misfortune comes, those parasites leave. And finally, it's a novel about the American dream possibility of remaking yourself, or if not the possibility, the temptation, and the fact that it might not actually be possible. Okay, so I'm going to stop this, and I'd like to open up, because I've talked for a while, I'd like to open up for some Q&A here about Fitzgerald's life. If anyone has any questions here that you would like to raise. Just if anyone has any questions at this point, feel free to just shout them out.
Just a point of clarification. When you said that Fitzgerald had a problem getting past, and that you were referring to women as a commodity, what was that comment? Can you clarify a little more about that?
Yeah, so Fitzgerald and the men he writes about see the women that they obtain, and it really is obtaining, as a way of social climb. So you have to have a woman of a certain class who is recognized as being in that class in order to move yourself up. That's what Fitzgerald wanted from Ginevra in Chicago. That's why he went for the most eligible bachelorette in Montgomery, Alabama. That's why Gatsby wants Daisy. And that's why Tom needs to show that he is going to possess Daisy, because Tom rightfully belongs to that class. So I see women in this novel particularly as a kind of medium of exchange and display among men. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, that did. Thank you so much. I had a very interesting conversation on gender roles with my students actually last week when we were doing all the background building for The Great Gatsby, and this is something that they touched on, but I think it's something that I'll make sure that I point towards while we are working on it. Thank you.
Yeah, gender roles are very rich in this novel. Thank you. Are there other questions? I see a hand up from Brittany Leach.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so I have a question. I know that Zelda Fitzgerald Fitzgerald actually died in a fire that happened during her institutionalization. Is that a word? So I was just curious, did she die before Fitzgerald or did she die after?
After.
Okay. And then my
1947, I believe, was when she died.
My other question was, what are you thinking, or in terms of the theory that Zelda actually wrote some of Fitzgerald's writing? Do you have any thoughts on that, or any?
I don't buy it.
No? Okay.
No, her writing was very different. And when he actually did sit down and do the writing, he was so cautious with it. I don't buy it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Ms. Painter.
Yes, Annika. Hey, I just was fascinating with your comment about how Fitzgerald was very honest and knew his own work. He knew if it was good or bad. I see that in Nick. Do you see that connection between Nick, our narrator?
The degree to which Nick is a depiction of Fitzgerald himself, it's undeniable. It's undeniable. And the way that he kind of fades into the background and observes these people and writes down these people, and the way that his own prose and the way he is so deliberate and cautious and thoughtful, that's very much Fitzgerald. I think that it's hard not to read it that way. And in fact, I think it's so difficult to read it not read it that way that it becomes dangerous, because it's not an autobiography. And our temptation is, and students' temptation even more, as you know, is to read it as autobiography. And Nick is a fictional character, but he's a fictional character that he was extremely close to his author. Now, I did see a question in the chat by B. Ford 6680. Do you touch on Nick's sexuality when you teach the novel? And I really don't, but in my rereading for this class, I really did start to notice there's something going on there. And this is something, and I don't know to what degree you would be comfortable talking about this with your class, but there are very small hints that Nick is gay. There's a scene, and I think it's at the end either of chapter 3 or chapter 4, where he's in New York City with everybody else, and there's a big party, and everybody gets drunk, and he's like, it's only the second time I've ever been drunk. And then he kind of blacks out, and then he's standing next to a guy's bed, and the guy's in his underwear. And we're like, how'd you get in there? Also, although he tells us that he's in love with Jordan, the way he describes Jordan is always very masculinized. He emphasizes her small bosom, her sort of androgynous figure, and he describes her in very male ways. And so there has been discussion among critics that Fitzgerald was trying to say, sort of under the table, that Nick is, if not gay, sort of somewhat fluid. So I've never done that, but I think I would do it more now, definitely. Any more questions before we move on to the context part? Oh, I do see one more. So Mary Sims is saying, my students had emotional reactions to the conversation on race in the first chapter. How would the conversation on race have been viewed by the readers in the time period? I'm actually going to address that in this next section. Okay, other questions about Fitzgerald's biography? Anything else? Okay, awesome. All right, back to the screen sharing. Okay. On the resources file that's available to you, I have put links to 3 quite good films about Fitzgerald's life. I particularly recommend the Winter Dreams, Fitzgerald's Life Remembered. You probably are not going to want to show a 90-minute documentary to your students in class. There is a bio.com like 4-minute thing. I find, I think Winter Dreams is the best one, but I think the Sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald, the one the BBC did, which is hosted by Jay McInerney. And if any of you know the name Jay McInerney, he was a very popular American novelist of the 80s and 90s who saw himself as the second coming of Fitzgerald. the guy who wanted to just go hang out with all the rich people. His most famous novel is his first novel, Bright Lights, Big City. Interestingly enough, the first novel ever written in second person voice, well worth reading, about sort of like hanging out with rich people in New York City. But Sincerely, F. Scott Fitzgerald, even if you don't show it to your students, it's worth a watch yourself, because McInerney is repellent in some ways, but really, really interesting in other ways. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk about the historical context, and I've broken them into some categories. And I know that most of you are going to know a lot of these things, and some of you are not going to know some of these things. But when I teach this novel to freshmen and sophomores, as I often do, I use these contexts as introductions to further research for the students, because they're often interested in these topics. And so I will bring some materials to the students, but mostly I will have them do the further research on it. And most of these topics, you can easily find a lot of things on it. I have provided some valuable and I think credible web links to good research on these topics in the ancillary materials, but you probably have some of your own. Okay, so first of all, students are interested in the Roaring Twenties. I don't know why, but they still are. I teach a class called the Jazz Age, and even though we are now 100 years out from it, my students still have some sort of romance that they think about the Jazz Age and the Roaring Twenties. So the Fitzgerald called it, as I said, in my biographical presentation, in the crack-up essays, he called it the greatest, gaudiest spree in history. One way to frame it to your students is that after the First World War, there was a desire to forget that war and to return to what I believe it was President Harding called normalcy. So we just wanted to forget about all the things that are going on in the world. We want to forget about the tragedy. Of course, we didn't lose as many people and we didn't have our territory destroyed as they did in Europe, but still we had 2 million people serving overseas who saw some pretty ugly stuff, and they come back. Also, our economy is doing great. It's a good time to be alive. It's a good time to be an American in the 1920s. And so people start really sort of partying, having fun, and there's a very frivolous feel in the culture that Fitzgerald's fiction not only depicts, but helped to build. And that's important to tell your students. He's not just writing about it. His fiction helped make it. We think about flappers. We think about all these new roles for women. I'll talk about that a little more later, but that is a crucial element of the Roaring Twenties. Women in the war started to get out of the house and go to work. And they got used to being out of the house and working and having their own money. More and more women were being educated, and they were leaving the farm, and they were moving to the cities. So women are playing a greater role in American public life. They get the vote in 1919. So they're playing a greater role in American political life as well. The booming economy, especially through the stock market, made it a great time economically. There was a lot of gambling going on, and so there was no shortage of people who were comparing the stock market and then the illicit gambling that was going on. We see the illicit gambling in the idea that Wolfsheim had fixed the 1919 World Series, and there was a lot of sort of moral relevance about like, hey, you know, gambling the stock market, gambling by fixing the World Series, same thing. And then, of course, Prohibition. Prohibition, I'll get into that in a second, but Prohibition also defined the 1920s. Gatsby takes place on the North Shore of Long Island, just outside of New York City. And I think people generally locate West Egg as being this town called Great Neck. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it's real close to the city, just outside of Queens. What's important to understand here, because so much of the novel takes place not just on the Long Island suburbs, but in New York City itself, is how New York City was the most unique place on earth in the 1920s. No place else on earth was like it because of the density of population and the physical environment of skyscrapers. The United States at this time was rapidly urbanizing. In fact, in the 1920s, the 1920 census was the first time that there was more Americans living in urban areas than in rural areas. That's when we tilted, the 1920 census. New York City had grown enormously because of the influx of immigrants largely from Eastern and Southern Europe, starting in the 1880s. And then, as we'll talk about in a second, coming to a complete halt in the 1920s, or essential halt in the 1920s. But the United States is rapidly urbanizing, and New York City is where it's intensely happening. Skyscrapers. No place else on earth had skyscrapers. It's hard to imagine how people felt the first time you were in one of these canyons. I'm sure you can imagine the first time you went to New York City or to Chicago and are in one of these canyons. It is a different physical feel. And people were coming to New York and being like, this is like nothing else. It's not like towers in Europe. This is completely different. The density and the energy and the lights and the noise and the cars, it was a different kind of environment than human beings had ever lived in. And that's important to keep in mind. Human beings were experiencing things that they never had before. It was also tons of money to be made. It still is. I mean, New York still is the kind of place that attracts people because you want excitement and you want urbanity and you want money. But the vast sums of money to be made on Wall Street, as we know, that led to the stock market crash. And what is Nick's job? He's a bond salesman. He's working on Wall Street. So as I said, New York City was absolutely the most exciting city on earth, the place you wanted to be in. And in the novel, you see that whenever the action moves from Long Island to the city, it gets more frantic. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more moving around. We're going uptown and we're going downtown and we're going to this speakeasy and we're doing this. Also, the city, and especially New York City, has always been the place where you go to remake yourself and become a new person. We see this with Nick. We see this with Gatsby. We see this with Wolfsheim. This is one of the quotes I really like about it. The racy, adventurous feel of it at night and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eye. So in the ancillary materials that I've provided, I have given a link to a 1921 10-minute long silent film by two artists named Paul Strand and Charles Sheeler, who was a poet. And it was simply taking pictures, and some moving and mostly still pictures, of Manhattan in 1921. It's a beautiful little film, and it's well worth watching and even showing to your students, just to say, like, this is what it felt like to be in Manhattan at this time. To be in these kind of like oceans of people and the smoke and the skyscrapers and everything. I strongly recommend showing that to your students, just to give them a feel for the city. Okay, so the Jazz Age. Fitzgerald's actually the one, as I mentioned before, who popularizes the term. What does it mean? Well, so jazz music was rapidly growing in popularity in the 1920s. In popularity, I mean, among white audiences, among middle-class audiences. It was initially, as I'm sure you know, an African-American form that had been founded in New Orleans by Kid Ory and Louis Armstrong and various others. But popular recordings that, again, were more accessible in the 20s brought this kind of music to northern audiences, to white audiences. And then these bands that had started out in New Orleans and were based there, Fletcher Henderson's band, Sidney Bechet's band, then started moving up where the money was and coming to New York City. White performers then were also learning to play this music. These bands sometimes were integrated, and that was threatening to an increasingly racist social order as well. So there were no integrated bands allowed in New York City outside of Harlem. Cotton Club bands could be integrated. You couldn't have integrated bands elsewhere. And in most other cities, such as Chicago and St. Louis, that had good music scenes, integrated bands were not allowed. Important performers, and again, you can easily find sometimes even video clips, but definitely music clips to show to your students. The Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Bessie Smith, and Sidney Bechet. Those are, it gives you a really good sense of what 1920s jazz felt like. I also, and again, for those of you who might be teaching the plays of August Wilson, August Wilson wrote a play called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is about the blues singer Ma Rainey dealing with a recording session in the 1920s. That actually, if you're going to talk about the jazz age and jazz music and the treatment both of African Americans and of women musicians at the time, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom is a nice thing to pair with Gatsby. And there's a good movie of it. Okay, Prohibition. We all know about Prohibition. One of the things that a lot of people don't know, we know that it was about getting rid of alcohol. But the temperance movement was driven largely by women. This is one of the reasons that there was a lot of opposition to women's suffrage, because a lot of the men knew that the main issue for women was temperance and was prohibition. It was driven by religious leaders outside of the cities, and it was driven by anti-immigrant sentiment. It was driven by anti-immigrant sentiment because immigrants who were largely Catholic used alcohol in religious ceremonies. In communion, you have to have wine for communion. I mean, Protestants don't, Baptists don't use wine in communion. So in 1920, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors, as we all know. And because of that, bootlegging and speakeasies become huge illicit business opportunities. And this is the obvious connection here with Gatsby, is that's how Gatsby made his money. And that's, the drugstores. That's how Gatsby makes his money. So students are always very interested in these ideas of bootlegging, and you can bring in Al Capone, and you can bring in organized crime and all that. Speakeasies are also very fun and interesting things to talk about and for students to research. And in the novel, they go to several speakeasies. And of course, Jake Gatsby made his fortune bootlegging. Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933. Okay. I've included in the sample assignments an essay that students might want to write about the American dream, because certainly the American dream is something that we all have an idea, and it means different things to all of us. Some of the positive ways in which the American dream is couched is that no matter what you start out as, you can become anything through work. Gatsby himself obviously represents that. America is the land of opportunity. The freedoms that America provides give everyone the opportunity to live the life they want. America has no class structure. Everybody is equal. All men are created equal. But also we see in this novel a subtext saying the American dream is not true. And this quote doesn't appear in the novel, but I think Fitzgerald had it in mind. Behind every great fortune is a great crime. The French novelist Balzac said that. And I think we definitely see that here in both with Gatsby and Wolfsheim. And the hint is that's also, there's some illicit source for the money of the aristocrats that we see in the book. Another way that people have interpreted it is that the American dream is actually a lie. The rich stay rich, and no one else can truly be accepted by them. The idea that there is no class structure in America is a lie. So always makes for a good discussion, at least in my classes, about what is this novel saying about the American dream? Is it true or is it a lie? As I mentioned, Fitzgerald in his life was very concerned with wealth and class. In the novel, we see that Tom, Daisy, Jordan, and to a lesser degree, Nick, have all of the markers of American aristocrats. They're wealthy, they don't work, they have a Yale education, they don't do anything with their time, and they take pride in that. Also, the wealthy do not experience consequences for their actions. Jordan cheats at golf, and no one calls her on it. Tom and Daisy are reckless. They're awful people. In the novel, West Egg, which is where Gatsby's house is nouveau riche, so new money. East Egg is where the old money is. And so Gatsby talks about buying his big, huge mansion on West Egg so he could look across the bay at the rich people at East Egg. So class is marked by geography as well. The great quote about Tom and Daisy, but also about how the rich don't experience consequences, is this one. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. I don't know how political you want to get with your students, but Ivanka and Jared were often described using this quote by people who were opposed to them. So whether or not you think that they apply, it's up to you. But in another part of the novel, Fitzgerald talks about the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves. I have found with my students, they really like thinking about automobiles and the way that cars play into this novel. So we're entering into the auto age when this novel opens. The Ford Model T, which started to be manufactured in 1909, by the end of World War I, had made cheap cars widely available to middle-class families. And so cars were everywhere. And because cars were everywhere, it changes everything. It made, most importantly, it made people more mobile, but it promoted immorality. Because if you're a young person with your boyfriend or girlfriend and you want to go somewhere and be alone, well, where are you going to go? But when you have a car, there's a private space for you to go and do something away from the prying eyes of your teachers and your minister, and most importantly, your parents. So cars were a vector of immorality. Cars also changed the way that cities were laid out. It accelerated the suburbanization of cities. It's also, in this novel, we see that it's an indicator of the machine age, where people are starting to rely on machines more than animals for everyday work. And human beings are no longer dealing with animals all the time on a daily basis. You don't need horses to get someplace where you're going. You don't need horses to do farm work. Human beings are now interacting much more with machines. And so how does that change the way that human beings interact with the world if machines are the main way that we are getting work done rather than relying on animals or other humans? In the novel, Gatsby drives a gaudy yellow, cream-colored yellow Rolls-Royce coupe. And that car the fact that it is a non-mass-produced car, it is not a Model T, it is a car you have to special order, is another marker of his wealth, but also his new money, because Tom's car is a dignified blue. And of course, cars in Gatsby are a destructive force. Every time they're mentioned, they are somehow a destructive force. From the first time they're mentioned at that first party where Owl Eyes is driving the car and knocks off the one wheel, to, of course, the tragic ending of the story. Okay, so the changing roles for women. As I said before, due to the war, urbanization, and general cultural liberalization, women had now many more options outside the home. We talk about flappers. We all know what flappers are. It's fun to look at pictures of them. The androgynous look was in, and we see that in this novel. Daisy and Tom, though, they represent an older way of thinking about women. Early on in the novel, when Daisy's talking about her 2-year-old daughter, she's like, oh, I hope she grows up to be a beautiful little fool. That's the best thing a woman can be. And Tom constantly denigrates women who try to do anything except to be arm candy. And Daisy really thinks that's where it's at. So thinking about the different ways that women are depicted and the different feelings that the aristocrats in the book have about women, then Nick and Gatsby have about women, and then others have about women. So that's really important. Myrtle, who is a really important character, is actually a victim of these new freedoms that women are provided. Because although she can use these new freedoms to leave her husband and go to the city with her lover, and it ends up with her death. Because new freedoms for women are no match for the heedlessness and cruelty of the wealthy in the structure of this novel. So as I said before, I really do think that pairing Gatsby with Anita Luce's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is a winner if you have the time and the option to do that. They work together nicely. Okay, another context, World War I. As we know, the American Expeditionary Force went to Europe July 1917. Approximately 2 million men and women, about 50,000 women, eventually served overseas in the American Expeditionary Force, and over 100,000 of them died. So we didn't lose as many people as we did in the Second World War, but it was very significant. What's important for the novel is that the pointlessness of the war made many returning soldiers reject governments, churches, abstract ideas, things that they believed in, traditional morality, and made them look for hedonism. People wanted to focus on personal pleasure and gain and forget the war. And in the novel, both Nick and Gatsby have served overseas. So someone had asked in the chat about the discussion of race. Early in the novel, there's a book that Tom Buchanan is reading, and it's called The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against White Supremacy. It was a very popular racist tract that came out in 1920. Interestingly enough, published by the same publisher that published Gatsby. And it's basically a white supremacist manifesto. So in this book, Stoddard argues that the colored races are threatening the rightful superiority of white people. Now, this was a very widespread belief held by many people at the time, including President Wilson, let's not forget. So Stoddard's book was grounded in pseudoscience, and its ideas informed state governments that at the time were developing and further refining Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws sort of reached their highest point of refinement in the 20s. You know, we start when Reconstruction fails, and then they're building, and they get the Supreme Court decisions, and then after the war, they really reach their height. By having Tom obsessed with this, and he doesn't just talk about it in that first scene. There's a scene later where he's hoping that Daisy is discussing this novel with Nick. So he's really obsessed with it. By using this novel, Fitzgerald is criticizing the way that white aristocrats are using science to justify their dominance. One of the contexts that's not in the novel, but that is important to keep in mind, and that I think, particularly because of the centenary of the Tulsa race riots last year, is worth us looking at, would be the race riots that were happening after the First World War. When Black soldiers returned from the war, many of them had served, some served in combat. They demanded equal treatment at home. So in response, white mobs used violence, lynchings, and riots to reestablish what they saw as the rightful racial order. If Stoddard is talking to aristocrats, this is the idea put into practice. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Tulsa uprising, massacre, whatever you want to call it, in 1921, but there were dozens and dozens, and there were particularly bad ones. In addition to Tulsa, there was one in East St. Louis, Illinois, and there was a major one in Longview, Texas, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So having your students research this summer of riots, especially the summer of 1921, is a worthwhile thing to do as they think about these racist ideas that Tom Buchanan is reading and expressing. So the last slide here, I know that Texans like to think about Texas, and this novel has very little to do with Texas, but it might be worth having your students just think about what was going on here, what was going on in the state of Texas in the 1920s. It was a very different place than New York City and Long Island. It was still extremely rural and extremely agricultural, although, there was a big crash in cotton prices in 1921, which really led to great poverty across the state, and a further increase in sharecropping, which just impoverished more farmers. The oil industry, on the other hand, was growing dramatically, especially in West Texas and down in the sort of like near Dallas area. The 1920s resurgence of the Klan had a major effect on Texas politics, as it did in many other states. And then a sort of little fun fact is the most popular speakeasy owner in New York City was a woman, a beautiful woman, as you can see, from Waco, who ran Texas Guinans. And that was the absolute place you wanted to be. So that she was probably the most famous Texan among high society. Okay, so I think we've reached about the end of our time. And again, I do apologize for an information dump. The next one won't be anywhere near like this. We'll do more activities, but I wanted to get this information out there so we can work with it next time. But what I would like you to do for next time is here's an assignment that I often do with my students in my American Lit class. It's a fun assignment. Make a meme having to do with our reading. Any of our authors, any of our books, anything. And then what we do is we post all of them on a social media site, and then I have my students and other students in the school vote on them, and then the top 5 vote getters get like some extra credit points. So how about if we make a Gatsby meme? It would be a fun assignment for your students, and so I challenge you to make a Gatsby meme and send it to me. And then what I'll do is I'll choose some of the best ones and share them as our opener next time. And I'm just going to say that I am proud of the one on the left, which I just made, which isn't the funniest meme, but I think I was using some recent things. The one on the right, I think is sort of stupid, but anyway, literary memes can be very funny, but they can also be a way for students to sort of see some of the underlying meanings in a piece of